The Republican Party has changed a lot over the course of its history. It's changed a lot over the course of the last decade, even. Because of this, understanding the Republican Party and therefore a huge part of American politics can be difficult. Today, I'm going to do my best to explain the different factions that make up the Republican coalition in 2025. When I saw the comments on my last video breaking down the coalitions inside the Democratic Party asking me to make this video, I was a little hesitant at first because I am not a conservative, and I've seen some other people making videos breaking down the factions inside the Republican coalition before. But by popular demand, I believe I have broken new ground on Republican explaining, and so I'm happy to present to you my 2025 Republican political compass. Let me explain what's going on here. I've placed different prominent members of the Republican coalition on this chart. Some of these people represent themselves, some represent broader tendencies within the party. First off, on the y-axis, we have elite versus base. This represents how influential someone or some faction is with the elites of the Republican Party versus the base of the Republican Party. Elites would be people like politicians, staffers, donors, journalists, people like that. The base is just average people. On the x-axis, we have one of my favorite ways of categorizing conservatives, from things all went wrong recently to things went wrong a long time ago. The longer you think it's been since America or Western civilization or humankind went off the rails and began its long descent into oblivion, the further left you are on this chart. The fact that the Republican Party holds the presidency right now, and the fact that Donald Trump has dominated the party for a decade now, means that I think just talking about the policy differences between these factions would get a little boring. You do see Republican infighting, don't get me wrong, between the more budget hawks and the rest of the party, for example. But the fact that the Democrats do not have a clear leader or agenda right now makes analyzing some of their policy divisions more clear on the surface, at least in my opinion. So I think my method of organizing is fun, but I also think it's somewhat useful because it allows us to see some of the differences between Republican Party factions more clearly than we otherwise could if we were just talking about how much they support Trump's agenda or something. Okay, so first I want to talk about the most populated quadrant I have on the chart here, the things went wrong recently / appeals to the base corner of the chart. These are people who are conservative for a time that isn't all that far gone, relatively speaking, like 100 years ago max, and are also predominantly appealing to the base of the Republican Party rather than to party elites. The most important person in this corner of the chart is, of course, that's right, Representative from Kentucky, Thomas Massie. Don't worry, we'll get to Trump next, but this is actually some important context. Massie is on this chart because he is kind of like that Japanese soldier that didn't know Japan lost the war like 30 years ago, but for the libertarianish Republicans that sprung out of the Tea Party movement. It wouldn't surprise me if he's holed up somewhere in the Rayburn office building with a pocket constitution and a pile of Ayn Rand books to use as projectiles, and he's refusing to surrender unless Ron Paul himself comes down to DC to relieve him from duty. Massie is a quintessential example of the kind of populist, libertarianish Republican that emerged during the Obama years with the Tea Party movement, which was ostensibly all about fiscal conservatism, but I think was also pretty clearly tapping into some other tendencies within the American right wing. This movement thought that government spending was out of control, government debt was out of control, and socialism was coming to America via Obamacare. You might be confused why Massie is so close to Trump on this chart. After all, he fights with Donald Trump all the time about spending, about bombing Iran. Trump is always going after him and will certainly try and primary him in the midterms. Massie's Tea Party brand of libertarian republicanism at first glance seems to be very different from establishment MAGA. Massie is where he is on this chart because he had one of the most interesting moments of self-reflection I've ever seen in American politics. Here's what he said. From what I observed, not just in Iowa, but also in Kentucky, up close with individuals, was that the people that voted for me in Kentucky and the people who had voted for Ron Paul in Iowa several years before were now voting for Trump. In fact, the people that voted for Rand in a primary in Kentucky were preferring Trump. Massie, Rand Paul, and Ron Paul were all generally considered to be part of this contingent of libertarian Republicans. All this time, Massie explained, I thought they were voting for libertarian Republicans. But after some soul searching, I realized that when they voted for Rand and Ron and me in these primaries, they weren't voting for libertarian ideas. They were voting for the craziest son of a bitch in the race. And Donald Trump won best in class as we had up until he came along. Up until Donald Trump, the burn it all down instinct that exists in the American right-wing base was channeled through the Tea Party and through figures like Massey and the Pauls, who promised a new style of politics in DC. But in 2016, Rand Paul got crushed in a presidential primary.
First of all, Rand Paul shouldn't even be on this stage. He's number 11. He's got 1% in the polls, and how he got up here, there's far too many people. Anyway, as far as temperament, and we all know that,
by a guy who recognized that cultural grievance politics were more salient than whatever Rand Paul was selling. The base moved on. And they moved on, of course, to the next character on our chart, Donald Trump. His actual platform, tariffs, mass deportations, reshaping the administrative state, is probably all basically familiar to you by now, so I won't spend too much time telling you what you already know. Donald Trump was pretty hard to put on this chart, and he's really the reason why I decided to use the axes that I did rather than anything explicitly ideological, because to a certain extent, to be a Republican in 2025 is to agree with Donald Trump. So you might ask, not unreasonably, why he's not higher up on the chart, considering how he has, over the last 10 years, reshaped the entire Republican Party apparatus. The elites of the party are now largely his elites. The reason why I have him where I have him on the chart is because his power to do this, to reshape the party, his ability to maintain loyalty when everyone knows that a good chunk of influential people within the Republican Party, even people that he hires personally, hate him, is because he commands essentially absolute loyalty among the Republican Party base. Even as President Trump's approval rating continues to fall among independents, he's at 29% among independents compared to almost 50% among independents at the start of his term. The percentage of Republicans who approve of Donald Trump has stayed basically flat at 90%. This command of the base is important because it allows Donald Trump to play kingmaker in Republican primary elections. Since the people that vote in primary elections are generally more partisan, if you're a Republican politician and you do something to irritate Donald Trump, there's a very real chance that a well-funded primary challenger endorsed by the man himself is going to show up in your district, and there's a very real chance that you will lose your job. In terms of when Trump is actually nostalgic for, there's been some theories. I hope you will excuse my inability to believe that Donald Trump is actually a very serious or deep historical thinker.
A lot of wars there was no reason for. You know? You look right up there, I don't know, see the Declaration of Independence, and I say, I wonder if the Civil War, it always seemed to me maybe that could have been solved without losing 600,000 plus people.
But however deep his understanding actually is, he has been relatively consistent in pointing out the turn of the century, sometimes called the Gilded Age, and he has on several occasions cited President William McKinley as an influence, specifically because of how William McKinley championed tariffs. If you want to learn a little more about tariffs and William McKinley, check out this video I made on tariffs. Next, I want to talk about MAHA, or the Make America Healthy Again movement, represented here by RFK Jr. RFK Jr. ran a doomed presidential campaign in the 2024 cycle, first trying to primary Biden, then taking a swing at being an independent before finally endorsing Trump. For a long time, there's been communities of people all over the political map that have had unorthodox theories about food or pharmaceuticals or why people get sick or have certain conditions. RFK Jr. is not a big fan of processed food dyes, fluoride, all that kind of stuff. RFK Jr.'s big accomplishment was uniting most of these groups, left-wing hippies, people who believe in faith healing, homeopathic medicine people, the anti-vax movement that got a big jolt of energy after the COVID pandemic. These are groups of people that might otherwise not have been allies, but were united on a few key issues, including a kind of general distrust of the establishment related to health and medicine. I think you could make a case for RFK Jr. being further left along the bottom of the chart, because so much alternative medicine stuff is about older, better ways of doing things that the establishment has hidden or whatever. I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples, but just as one example, RFK Jr. has talked about miasma theory in his book, which is a theory of how disease spreads that has to do with bad vapors emanating from rotting things. This is how a lot of people thought disease worked before we discovered that microbes were actually causing disease. This is known as germ theory. So put him wherever you like, really, but I put him where I did because he clearly plays up the 60s Kennedy nostalgia, and a lot of alternative medicine trends got started in the 60s or 70s as well. Combine this with whatever superpowers you get from drinking methylene blue, and you have a recipe for a potent ally of the Trump administration, which has shown itself to be willing to make some, shall we say, unorthodox decisions when it comes to hiring. Next, we have Charlie Kirk.
What does fetus mean in Latin?
What the f? I'm sorry, is this
It means little human being.
Ooh, his smile is very creepy.
Charlie Kirk is, above all else, and I mean this in the most neutral way I can possibly say it, a propagandist. It's what he is. He goes wherever the center of the Republican Party goes. I chose Charlie Kirk to represent this section, but I think you could fit a lot of the big conservative outlets in this category. I think a lot of Fox News goes in this category, for example. Charlie Kirk's actual philosophy has changed over the years as Christian nationalism has become a bigger force on the American right wing. He's started to embrace this vision of the world a little more, just for one example of how he's changed a little. These days, he doesn't believe in the separation of church and state. We'll talk a little more about Christian nationalism later, but I think he's fundamentally going where a lot of the mainstream GOP goes. His embrace of this position, I think, tells you a little bit about where the GOP is these days. Charlie Kirk, like many Republicans that I'd put on the right-hand side of this chart, believes things really started going wrong with wokeness, and he believes wokeness got started with postmodern neo-Marxism. Specifically, you hear Kirk and others like him, Christopher Rufo comes to mind here, talk about the march through the institutions, which is what this set of right-wingers say is a multi-decade movement of leftists gradually infiltrating and infecting American institutions like companies, governments, and universities when they realized that the traditional Bolshevik-style Marxist revolution wasn't going to happen, basically. This idea seems to have inspired a lot of right-wing thinkers lately. Kirk and Rufo, for example, I think would love to use the power of the state to entrench conservative people and ideas within American institutions. Charlie Kirk's aggressive debate bro style in defense of the basic establishment MAGA positions combined with the institutional support he gets through his organization, Turning Point USA, puts him somewhere near the center on the base versus elite dichotomy. Our last group in this quadrant is the Pod Bros. I'm using the Nelk Boys to represent this faction. These are the new media bro-ish type podcasts that endorsed Trump in the last election, but sometimes for more of just a vague sense of Trump being cool or anti-establishment rather than anything all that ideological. There's a ton of these podcasts or shows, and they all have like 10 million monthly listeners. They're super popular with men and especially younger men. I'm speaking in generalities here, but I don't think these guys are really longing for a world that they think is all that far in the past. On average, I'd say they're culturally conservative for like the 2010s. You don't typically see this group talking about the dangers of gay marriage or legalized marijuana, for example. And I wouldn't say that they're all typical models of Christian virtue. This group isn't a monolith. They have a lot of common interests and they appeal to a lot of the same demographics, but they don't all literally have the same views. A lot of these guys think of themselves as more independent or centrist than Republican partisans. And lately I've seen some of them express anger or frustration with the Republican Party about Israel, Iran, and some of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement actions, as well as the Trump administration's continuing inaction on the Epstein files. I don't think these shows are thought leaders within elite spaces within the Republican Party, but they do absolutely shape the views of a ton of men who think of themselves as not especially political or somewhat passively conservative, which is why I have their influence on the base side of this chart. Politicians and people that want to reach this young male demographic go on these shows to do it. I think a lot of these guys don't necessarily realize the power that they actually have with their platforms. Netanyahu can get an interview wherever he wants, whenever he wants, but he chooses to do an interview with the Nelk Boys for a reason, just as an example. I wonder, what do the Nelk Boys think it says about what Netanyahu thinks about them and what they're doing that someone affiliated with Netanyahu thought it was appropriate to give the Nelk Boys a script with questions to ask?
I'll be honest, they gave us a paper with questions to ask. But they also said they gave us a script to ask, but we didn't really follow it. Yeah. We tried our very best to ask some questions, but
I don't know, maybe if you're not educated enough about something, maybe don't do the interview. In this way, you won't end up asking a guy responsible for an ongoing famine and what Israel's former defense minister calls an ethnic cleansing if he prefers Burger King or McDonald's.
Burger King. We did the double, the
Whopper?
big- yeah, the double.
I haven't ripped Burger King in a long
it's
time.
not.
Burger
they call
King
it
kind of
something
sucks.
Yeah.
No,
the,
you're wrong.
the BK
I like-
Lounge can hit. If
I
you're-
disagree completely.
You like
I
Burger
mean,
King over McDonald's?
That's your
Absolutely.
worst take, I think.
Moving to the top right corner, we have people who think things went wrong relatively recently that are more influential or popular with conservative elites. First up, we have MAGA revisionism, also known as MAGA with country club characteristics. Depicted here as a hydra, we have Greg Abbott, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Ron DeSantis for the heads of the hydra. It's a hydra because there's basically an infinite number of these guys, politicians who are, in their own ways, trying to put a little shine on the MAGA movement. All the media figures that supported DeSantis in 2024 before flipping to Trump in the end go here too. This group thinks that you can do the MAGA stuff while still being a basically normalish politician. Fundamentally, I think this group misunderstands that Trump's political success does actually have a lot to do with who he is as a person. A good chunk of the country, at least his base, enjoys his personality. Basically, they like how he gets under the skin of liberals and progressives. They like that he is a blunt instrument with which to whack their cultural enemies. Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott aren't fun in that way. They're just Republican politicians that happen to be operating in a political environment dominated by Donald Trump and MAGA. Vivek Ramaswamy is a really interesting example of this to me. He has his whole civic nationalism bit that he does. He absolutely tries to present a more polished vision of MAGA, but the incongruence between his kind of civic nationalism and the Republican Party of J.D. Vance ranking the Americanness of people based on when their ancestors first got here is pretty hard to miss. I'll pick up more on this later, but just as an example of what I'm talking about, check out this moment from an interview that he did.
Oh, and I agree with many, many things you said during, in fact, probably more than most other candidates when you were running for president, but I still would not have voted for you because you're an Indian. We'll get back to that. And it's directly related to what you were just talking about. The thing about nationalism, you're totally right. It is like to use the word nationalism. Oh, it's Hitler, it's Hitler. And Hitler had soup. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have soup.
This is just the most embarrassing thing in the world to me. This ghoul just said that she wouldn't vote for him because of his race. And he has to sit there and nod politely because he knows that there's literally nothing he could say to defend himself that wouldn't irritate a non-trivial portion of the American right wing. Up top, we have our old friend Holden Bloodfeast. Check out my video about 12 types of American politician if you're interested in hearing more about this guy. He's here representing the Republican Warhawk faction. These guys are not really popular at all with the base of the party anymore. To some extent, Trump's rise within the Republican Party was made possible because the base thought it was rejecting this type of guy. However, they do exist. Take a look at the reactions that a lot of Republicans had to the Iran bombings or Trump threatening to turn Gaza into a beach resort, and you'll find Holden Bloodfeast. I think it's important to remember, if I can go on a tangent here for a second, that while the Republican Party has changed a lot since the Bush years, there are some common threads. The unitary executive theory, for example, that's not something that the Trump administration just invented out of thin air. It's not new. The last group I want to address in this quadrant are people who consider themselves to be sort of centrist-ish. Some of these people will call themselves classical liberals who support Republicans because of the excesses of woke. They don't typically think America was all that bad until pretty recently. A similar situation to the Pod Bros, but catering to people who think sports betting is low-class behavior. The Free Press is the image that I chose to represent this group. The Free Press is a publication founded by ex-New York Times op-ed writer Barry Weiss. They're on the elite side of this chart because of how influential Weiss is with elites. The famous pollster Frank Luntz once said that she doesn't just speak to the 1%, but to the 100th of 1%. The message of this zone that the illiberal woke left has run amok and there's a lack of basic sanity on the American left generally these days seems to appeal to a lot of high-powered individuals who don't see themselves as conservatives necessarily, but do think society could use a little more conservatism. Here's a quip she made at a Federalist Society event.
And in recognizing allies, I'll be an example right now. I am a gay woman who is moderately pro-choice. I know that there are some people in this room who don't believe that my marriage should have been legal. And that's okay, because we're all Americans who want lower taxes.
Moving on to the next quadrant, we have people and groups within the Republican Party that are influential with elites and believe that things went bad a long time ago. First up, we have Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon is probably most well known for his role with Breitbart News and for his role within the first Trump administration and campaign. He's been called a lot of things, and he probably enjoys being called a lot of things. He clearly enjoys attention. He enjoys being provocative. At the heart of Bannon thought, though, I think is the idea that the Western world is in an existential struggle against the forces that would destroy it. These enemies of the West, for Bannon, include all the usual suspects. He is a right-wing nationalist populist. In this video that Dreg made about fractures in the right-wing coalition, he calls Bannon a post-racial fascist. I'm not so sure I'd go so far as to say that he's post-racial. I think at the very least he seemed pretty comfortable aligning himself with racists over the years.
Let them call you racist.
Laissez-vous appeler raciste.
Let them call you xenophobes.
Mais laissez-vous appeler xénophobe.
Let them call you nativist.
Laissez-vous les appeler nativistes.
Wear it as a badge of honor.
But I do actually like that description because it does capture something about Bannon and how I think he views himself as a sort of generalized force against the ills of the modern world. He opposes internationalism of all kinds with the possible exception of collaboration among the world's right-wing populist movements. He's clearly not just limited to opposing the way the world's gone since World War II either. He cited the work of Julius Evola, for example, who I just cannot get into explaining here, but he's a kind of esoteric fascist, basically. I think Bannon is a lot less influential than he used to be, at least with the Republican elites, and he has been very effective at selling his own hype in a lot of cases. I would put him somewhere in the middle of the base elite spectrum because of how much he does not get along with the other elites in the Republican Party, but at the same time, he is undoubtedly known as a guy who works with, influences, and interfaces with the Republican Party elites. Next is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel represents the tech elite faction. I chose Thiel for this category rather than someone like Elon Musk because I feel like Peter Thiel has a more intelligible philosophy. Peter Thiel is a billionaire tech investor who is very influential within right-wing American politics. J.D. Vance, for example, used to be his employee, and Thiel donated millions of dollars to support Vance's run for U.S. Senate. Peter Thiel also has some pretty out there ideas.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would
this is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit
Should
in this.
the human race survive?
Yes.
In addition to his sort of transhumanism that seems very characteristic of where a lot of the Silicon Valley AI, we're going to build God and then make him work for us type people are these days, Thiel has some ideas about government. Years ago, he wrote an article called The Education of a Libertarian, in which he declares that he does not believe that freedom and democracy are compatible. This should tell you a little bit about what he considers freedom to be. Some might say that meaningful freedom requires some say in who rules you, but not Peter Thiel. But to understand exactly what this means in practice, we have to turn to the next character on the chart here, Curtis Yarvin. A whole lot has been made of Yarvin lately, and it's true he is influential. He is certainly influential on Peter Thiel. Yarvin has called Thiel fully enlightened with reference to his philosophy before. I want to keep this relatively simple because this guy has written a ton over the years. I remember coming across some of his stuff years and years ago. Curtis Yarvin basically thinks that the Enlightenment, the 17th and 18th century movement that championed things like reason, political freedom, the rights of individuals, the small L liberal ideals of things like the American Revolution, have been a complete and total disaster. He believes that modern nation states should be abolished and replaced with a government that kind of resembles how a corporation works, where the CEO / president / king, Yarvin likes to talk up the virtues of monarchy a lot, would be able to rule better than our current clunky constitutional republic. Some highlights of Yarvin's Brave New World would be turning unproductive people into fertilizer or otherwise entombing them in virtual reality prisons. Yarvin and Thiel are at the top left corner of this chart on the left because for all their tech aesthetics, they fundamentally think that the world took a pretty bad turn in many ways with the Enlightenment. And they're at the top because the base mostly has no idea who these guys are, and they're very influential with elites nonetheless. Speaking of being influential with elites, Yarvin has been cited as an influence multiple times by the next character on this chart and current vice president of the United States, J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is actually very connected to a few different strains of the post-liberal right wing. Post-liberal is a catch-all term that refers to people that have critiques of liberalism, basically. Again, not necessarily just liberalism as in Democrats in the United States, but Enlightenment liberalism. In my opinion, post-liberal is kind of a misnomer. In its actual orientation, they are big fans of the world that existed pre-liberalism. J.D. Vance is an adult Catholic convert. Like many other adult Catholic converts on the right, I would guess is probably most interested in the strain of post-liberalism that comes specifically out of Catholic philosophy. You'll often hear this referred to as Catholic integralism, which is basically this idea that not just Christianity, but Catholicism specifically should be the fundamental basis for society. You might be familiar with Christian nationalism, which is typically conceived of as a Protestant thing. We'll get to that later, but Catholic integralism is like Christian nationalism, but with a much longer reading list, more professor, less Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is a very influential ideology within elite conservative circles. In terms of its broad critiques of Enlightenment liberalism, it's been a very potent force behind a ton of the conservatives that you find these days advocating for a large, strong state that can enforce public morality for the public good. You'll find a Catholic integralist thinker that's influenced them. But Catholic integralism as a pure ideology, I think, has somewhat of a ceiling in the United States, considering both that a good chunk of evangelicals still think that Catholics aren't real Christians and only about 20% of the US population is Catholic. Hard to get a majority of the population on board with an anti-pluralist philosophy that excludes a majority of the population. J.D. Vance's philosophy is also very much against the idea of America as a nation defined by allegiance to certain ideas. He recently gave a speech at a Claremont Institute event where he defended the idea that those whose ancestors had been in the United States longer had a better claim on what it means to be American. He thinks it's ridiculous to define Americanness by agreement with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, not just because that definition of American would include tons of foreigners, but crucially because it would exclude Americans with a long heritage here that the ADL would label domestic extremists. These are his words, not mine. I think it's a little telling that J.D. Vance took a random snipe at the ADL here. This isn't the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU that we're talking about here. The ADL is an organization that focuses a lot on combating anti-Semitism specifically, that has hardly been excessively critical of the second Trump administration. They defended Elon Musk's awkward gesture, as they put it, at the inauguration. Who exactly is Vance worried about not making the cut for American, according to the ADL? Anyway, one of these days I need to go over this whole America isn't an idea thing that's so popular on the right wing these days. The subtext of this claim seems to be that ethnic nationalism, by comparison, is some sort of transcendent non-idea that has just always existed, which is just self-evidently ridiculous, I think, considering it's just an idea as well, and one that absolutely was not always just self-evident to people. We can track its progress through history. Turns out just ideas can be pretty powerful and pretty meaningful to people. Anyway, that's for another time. The last character / group represented in this quadrant is the young GOP staffer class, represented here by a Zoomer apparently running for California governor as a Republican, Kyle Langford. I can tell you from my own personal experience, the young people who work in professional Republican politics have had their brains totally scrambled. They're all reading insane internet reactionaries and competing with each other for who can be the most based on Twitter. It's this guy from that Mehdi Hasan Jubilee debate copy-pasted.
You're a little bit more than a far-right Republican.
Hey, what can I say?
I think you could say I'm a fascist.
Yeah, I am. Absolutely.
I'm not talking about all young conservatives here, obviously, but there's a few reasons why so many young people in professional conservative world specifically have become very Groyperized. This is just my speculation though, so take it for what it's worth. So really reason number 0 is the internet and how the internet has radicalized a lot of different groups of people. But number 1 is that normal conservatives are more likely to go into other fields in the first place, because politics isn't typically a place you go if you want to maximize the return on investment you get from a college degree. I think liberals and the parents of liberals are less likely to demand ROI, at least in a clear way, from a degree. So you end up with more than just the most dedicated ideologues going to work for Democrats as staffers. The second reason is that young conservatives that are willing to go through the process of getting the kind of liberal arts education typical of political staffers many times come out with a huge chip on their shoulder, because unless they went to Liberty University or something, they were probably in the vast minority in class the whole time. The third reason is that young conservatives have grown up in an environment where so much of what it means to be a conservative is just doing and saying and believing whatever owns the libs the most. There's constant pressure to be more radical. You get social credibility in these circles by being edgy. Just saying mass deportations doesn't hit the same anymore. You have to take this picture like Kyle Langford did if you want that kind of attention these days. There's definitely more than all this involved, and absolutely I don't want to discount the role that actual ideology plays here. I definitely don't want to chalk it all up to my armchair psychology, but I think this all contributes to why, for instance, a guy called Bronze Age Pervert is known to be a popular figure among the GOP staffer class. These guys all basically think they're soldiers in the post-liberal revolution, so they're on the left of the chart and they're in the middle of the elite base spectrum because they're very prevalent in the online base, but if they laid out their philosophy to the average Republican over the age of about 30, they'd sound, again, like that kid from the Mehdi Hasan Jubilee debate, spouting off about the friend-enemy distinction and Carl Schmitt. The last quadrant on this chart is people who are influential with the base and believe that things went wrong a long time ago. The first group on this chart is the conspiracy right, represented here by Marjorie Taylor Greene and Alex Jones. There could be whole documentaries, and I guess to be fair, there have been whole documentaries talking about the beliefs of the conspiracy right. Instead of just cataloging the insane things that they believe, because this would take all day and not really be very informative, I want to try and emphasize that this group doesn't just believe in a few conspiracies. They see the world through a conspiratorial lens. This must, in all honesty, be a very frightening place to be mentally. All information is processed through the lens of an all-consuming battle between the good and just people in the New World Order, the deep state, or the Freemasons, or whatever. The exact enemy doesn't actually particularly matter, I don't think. I think this represents a certain pattern of thinking that I believe would exist regardless of the set of actual facts available. They are very influential with the base of the Republican Party, but I don't think that the elites of the party really take their ideas all that seriously. Important caveat to this is the fact that the conspiracy right has historically served as kind of an incubation chamber for ideas that are later taken up by the whole party, even if they get watered down a little bit along the way. Sometimes the appeal of some of the conspiracy rights ideas become so obvious that politicians can't ignore it. The language of the deep state is a good example here because it gelled nicely with the already existing elite conservative hatred of the administrative state. Our last figure on this chart is in the bottom left-hand corner, and it's megachurch televangelist Kenneth Copeland.
You can't manage that today. Right. This dope-filled world. Right. And get in a long tube with a bunch of demons.
Right. Kenneth Copeland is here representing the evangelical Christian right. You really can't understand the modern Republican Party without understanding this group. Evangelical is simultaneously a religious, social, and political identity. I'm going to be focusing on evangelicals as they intersect with politics. Evangelical Christians include groups like Southern Baptists, which is the large Protestant denomination in America, as well as groups like Pentecostals, which you may have heard of. When you think of the typical American megachurch, you're probably thinking of an evangelical Protestant church. As a group, evangelicals are conservative, especially on things we typically think of as social issues. They're very vocal in their anti-abortion advocacy, for example. The Southern Baptist Convention made headlines a while back for coming out against IVF even. Kenneth Copeland, as I understand it, is some sort of Pentecostal, but in truth, a lot of these big megachurches aren't exactly beholden to any sort of real structure beyond whatever the guy at the top happens to believe. And Kenneth Copeland believes that the more money you send him, the more money and good health God will bless you with. He's also an important figure in Christian nationalism. Specifically, Copeland promotes the Seven Mountains brand of Christian nationalism, which is the idea that Christians are commanded to take control of 7 important areas of culture, including the family, religion, government, media, the arts, and business. It's key to understand that this group believes in literal spiritual warfare, like literal demons waging a war against believers on earth. It's also important to mention that evangelical Christians are the big reason why the Republican Party is so pro-Israel. A lot of evangelical Christians believe that the creation of Israel fulfills a biblical prophecy that is necessary to bring about the end times. Evangelicals, again, I just want to underscore, are a broad group. They're a big group, and not every evangelical Christian believes in every bit of this. And every denomination, and to an extent, every church is going to be different. But it's also important to understand that this type of thing is out there, and it is hugely influential with the Republican base. Kenneth Copeland and people like him have huge followings. Copeland himself is the wealthiest televangelist in America. Evangelical Christianity is actually so important to the Republican Party that I added the evangelical cone to this chart, represented by 2 dashed lines emanating from Kenneth Copeland's gaze. Anywhere you imagine his gaze falling on the chart is to some extent influenced by evangelical Christianity. And as Christian nationalism becomes more of a force within the Republican Party, it's influenced by that too. So to summarize and really aggressively overgeneralize, what does each quadrant of the Republican Party here think is the big problem with America? This quadrant here says it's something to do with the establishment. This quadrant says woke. This quadrant says the Enlightenment. And this one says demons. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, become a channel member if you'd like to support me. See you next time.